Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm here with Dr. Justin Smith. As usual, it's good to be with you. We tape these on Mondays, so we don't know what happened in the election, so we're in this state of not knowing at this point.
Yeah.
And just praying for that leader, whoever that is. So we don't know at this point. But we are close to finishing up the Gospel of Mark, and we are really at the very end. We're going to have an episode now and then one following after, and we'll be concluding it. We think we've done about 24 episodes going through the Gospel of Mark. You're welcome to go back and watch any of those. If you have any questions, you can email me, Brian with a Y at glendale.church. We'd love to hear from you and hear your feedback, any questions that you have about the studies that we've been doing. We're going to start in chapter 15, starting in verse 21, as we get to the crucifixion of Jesus. And I'm going to go ahead and just read all the way through until the burial. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what they would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from that cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with some wine and vinegar, put on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes down to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and of Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of a rock. Then he rolled the stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid.
Well, I mean, there's really a lot of interesting stuff, I think, happening as we get to the crucifixion. Certainly one of the things to consider is some interesting names in this opening section here in 21 and following. Simon of Cyrene, father of Alexander and Rufus. Typically you don't get names mentioned unless they have some sort of relevance. So presumably Alexander and Rufus are, I don't know, maybe important figures at the time that Mark is writing. There is sort of this interesting connection. Rufus is mentioned, or a Rufus is mentioned in the letter to the Romans. And there is some tradition that suggests that Mark was writing from Rome or in connection to the Roman Church. So it wouldn't surprise me if Mark is using this eyewitness experience of Alexander and Rufus to craft his gospel, to sort of pull this narrative together. So certainly that possibility there. And then also, I think, kind of drawing us back into, I think, certainly as you previously mentioned, we have an election taking place. The political elements of what's going on here, there's multiple times in this section where Jesus is referred to as King of the Jews or King of Israel, and that certainly seems to be part of the political element of what's going on with Jesus here. Pilate, whether he thinks Jesus is a legitimate threat to Rome or not, certainly understands that there are some that are envisioning Jesus as some kind of king. Pilate doesn't seem to have a huge problem sentencing an innocent man to death. And the charge on the cross, or the charge over Jesus' head on the cross, is King of the Jews. So while we sort of think about the theological ramifications of Jesus' death, for Pilate and for those involved, they're seeing Jesus, at least in some way, as a political threat. Now, politics, religion, culture, the law, all of this is sort of woven together in the first century world, so they're not mutually exclusive categories, but certainly Pilate's not really engaged in kind of furthering God's theological purposes with Jesus' death. So the political element here, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting to just read Mark's account, thinking of it as the first account that we have, and that it's just really just we talked about this last time a bit, but just the mocking that's going on, just everybody walking by and saying, "Hey, if you can do this, like, come on, do this," and just how this Jesus just really just takes all that on and just basically cries out to God and just doesn't do anything, just kind of takes it all on.
Well, I think one of the things that I continue to struggle with, and it's something I do talk about with students a lot, I feel it is sort of this way that we've sanitized the cross, or we sanitized crucifixion. So one of the conversations that we'll have at various points during the school year is looking at the difference between a cross without Jesus' body on it and a cross with Jesus' body on it in our iconography. So you and I both grew up in the Churches of Christ, and I don't believe I ever saw Jesus' body on a cross in any of the churches that I grew up in. I'm not even sure that I saw that many crosses on any of the churches that I grew up in. I mean, certainly the idea of the cross, the meaning of the cross, the concept of the cross was there, but the imagery wasn't. And I think one of the things that we just forget is that this crucifixion is public, and Jesus is stripped naked, and there is this shaming element. The whole mocking element is shaming Jesus. And for us who don't live necessarily in an honor-shame society, this idea of being publicly shamed, I think, is a foreign one for us. So I think we experience guilt. We don't always experience shame. And guilt, I think, is very personal. It's sort of internal. Shame is very public. So whether it's the soldiers who are mocking him, or witnesses that are walking by and saying, well, you know, you're supposed to be the Messiah, save yourself. You're supposed to be the Messiah, like, demonstrate, you know, a Messiah doesn't get crucified is really the argument. And all of this is happening while he's nailed to this cross, while he's in extreme emotional pain, physical pain, psychological pain, and the embarrassment and the shame of all of this is sort of being heaped on top of him, all the while being innocent of all of the charges that have been leveled against him. So it's, I like, on some level, I like Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, because I think there's a way that Gibson is sort of drawing us into some of the harsh realities, like the harsh historical realities of what crucifixion would have been like. I don't think it's something that you can watch a lot, obviously, because it's really intense and there's a lot of brutality in it. But I would also point to the fact that crucifixion was incredibly brutal. Mm-hmm. And I think we at times don't really allow ourselves to wrestle with or see that brutality except a few times a year, and typically around Easter. But I mean, this whole thing it's tragic, it's brutal.
Yeah, and something that I had not really thought a lot about until very recently is the idea that he died naked. It's almost without debate that he would have, and we put a little cloth on him to sanitize the pictures, and I understand why we do that. but that just adds a whole other element to it of just like it's. I think of it as like the reverse of the Adam moment. Adam and Eve are in the garden; they're naked and they feel no shame. Jesus is naked to be as shamed as just basically as shameful as you can possibly be exposed.
That little bit of loincloth or what have you, I think, gives Jesus a dignity that he never actually received in his life. In his crucifixion, that little bit of dignity was not afforded him. And it doesn't seem like much, but I mean, in a lot of ways, like it really kind of obscures the indignity of this whole thing. I mean, it's an incredibly painful thing to think about if you really sort of lean into the reality of what's taking place here. And also, thinking about the fact that he's on the cross for hours. So this is not sort of a few minutes that he's on the cross, but I mean, we're talking about an extended period of time. Now, I mean, Jesus isn't as long on the cross as long as some. I mean, we have some accounts of people staying on crosses for days or weeks at a time. And I think just the unique situation of when Jesus is crucified and what time of year in Passover, makes it so that his body comes down. But if it hadn't been Passover, I mean, theoretically, his body could have stayed on that cross for an extended period of time, for days. Again, the idea of crucifixion was not execution. Lots of easier ways to kill people. Crucifixion is state-sponsored terrorism. It's propaganda. You put a body on a cross and you put it on a main thoroughfare so that anybody coming in and out of the city knows this is what happens when you defy Rome. And so you want to make this into as terrifying an object lesson as you possibly can. And so I think maybe what we don't always wrestle with is not just the sort of pain and the suffering of the cross, but the terror of the cross, and how that would have functioned psychologically in the first century.
Yeah, and just thinking of that being just the ending moment, and I think we don't sit enough with just the darkness of it, the midst of darkness. And then when darkness comes in our lives, we are surprised. Generally, I'd say in the West, we live pretty comfortably. We don't experience death as something that's maybe like right outside our door all the time, and so we can put a little bit off to the side. But there are times when this darkness comes to all of us, and I find great comfort in just the raw difficulty of this scene, that if you really allow yourself just to think about it, this isn't what God's do. This isn't what the Son of God should do or have to endure, but this is what God did. I think of the problem of pain that we all ask from time to time, questions that we're dealing with and struggling with. And what does it look like for me to like walk through this? Where is God when all of this is happening? And God's answer is on a cross. God is like, I'm not going to give you the answer and say, hey, you had cancer, so this happened. And there are good things that come out of hard stuff, but there's going to be stuff in all of our lives that there's just like an unsatisfactory answer for. And we get solidarity with Jesus.
Well, one of the things I say a lot is that we worship the God who suffers with us, not just for us. And I think, again, sort of theologically, what we've done is we've looked at this moment on the cross and we say Jesus suffered and died for us, which is absolutely true. But this is the God who suffered and dies with us. So God understands our suffering not sort of conceptually, but experientially, because God has suffered. God knows what it is like to lose a son because God has lost a son. So, I mean, for me, I've taken great comfort in that over the years, sort of embracing this idea of a God who embraces us in a way that I don't think sometimes we really think about. And Brian, I mean, I don't know what your most embarrassing or painful moment is in your life. Most of our embarrassing moments sort of take place in minutes. Jesus goes through this for 6 hours. 6 hours on the cross, not counting everything that led up to it and the betrayal the night before, and sort of all of this stuff sort of coming together in this experience. Again, I don't know how often we really wrap our minds around 6 hours on a cross. Pain and suffering, embarrassment, torment, taunting, all the while Jesus himself, I think, trying to process what all of this means. I think we see that in his ministry, he has a very clear idea of what this suffering and death is going to mean, but he still has to go through it. And here he is now, over this 6-hour period of the life just sort of slowly draining out of his body. I mean, it's really intense.
Yeah, no, it's something that's hard, and also the Psalm 22 quote.
Yeah.
My God, why have you forsaken me? I've heard this referred to as the time that Jesus was an atheist, and I think there is something profound in that. There's going to be times when we need to have the language of lament and be able to cry out and say, this is a messed up situation, and I want to be part of a better future. I think we're experiencing some of that with our nation as we think about racial justice in our world, but just in general, I think it's just it's a sad time where we are just crying out, God, what happened? Because we all were excited about 2020, like 2020 vision, and here we go, and it just hasn't turned out that way.
Not
and
really.
We are all left with this collective sense of lament. And we were talking about how it's going to be interesting to find ways, and what does engagement look like coming out of this time, like for everybody. Like the ways that we would communally lament have been taken away from us for the most part.
Yeah.
And so we're all in like our individual spaces, and I think, desperately need that moment of just standing together in solidarity.
Well, and Psalm 22 is really interesting. So, Psalm 22 opens up with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And through about the first half of that psalm, David is like really leaning into this experience of estrangement with God. But about halfway through that psalm, the tone changes. And about halfway through Psalm 22, give or take, David starts to draw us into not just the forsakenness of the first half, but the vindication of the second half of that psalm. So Psalm 22 actually ends on a high note. It ends in David being vindicated. And I've often argued and talked about this with students where I go, is it possible that when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he starts this quote of Psalm 22, that it's functioning in both ways, where on the one hand, it's Jesus who is tapping into the lament and being drawn into the lament of David, because Jesus feels forsaken in these moments, as we all would. I mean, this is not an easy thing for him, whether we're thinking about the way that sin is sort of functioning at this moment and where Jesus' relationship, or in relationship to sin, whether Jesus is, the feelings of estrangement on that level, the physical pain and torment and everything else. But is it possible too that there's, even in this moment of lament and pain and suffering, that as we're passing through lament, we're being drawn out to the vindication on the other side, which is where we'll obviously go in a bit with the empty tomb. That in the same way that Psalm 22 doesn't end with forsakenness, neither does Jesus' story. That even in the midst of this lament, there is still this sort of forward thinking and forward looking to the moment when God will intervene in unique and powerful ways and vindicate. And so I think there's something powerful in this. I mean, there's lots of things that Jesus could have sort of been drawn to in voicing lament. There's, Israel has,
there's
books
a
and
whole
books,
playbook,
Lamentations, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of places to use lament, but Psalm 22 is sort of an interesting choice, or an interesting connection that's being made.
Well, it's interesting to just think about how Psalm 23 is maybe the most popular passage in all of Scripture, and yet we hardly know Psalm 22. And I've some understanding a little bit of what you were talking about, that it starts with some lament and then goes into a deeper understanding of God's presence and a bit of vindication of victory. But yeah, it's something I think we need to maybe get into a little bit more, just understanding it, to get at what Jesus was saying. But I do appreciate that in this moment of pain, Jesus asks why. Just this question that we're all going to ask at one time or other. Just, God, why? Like, why is this happening? Why is this so hard? Where are you? What's happening? What's going on? And to think of Jesus in this moment of great anguish and embarrassment, all the above, to just have him just crying out, God, like, why is this the way? Why is this your way? And I think oftentimes what we try to do when those come up in us, we just like push them below the surface because we know, like, oh, that's not a good, Christian thought or whatever. But at some level, we have to let that emotion out at times, and it's sometimes using that kind of hard word and something that expresses that type of emotion that it really makes a difference.
Well, but I think you've already touched on this a little bit too. One of the things that's really powerful about lament is that lament is not individualistic; it's communal. So when David is writing these psalms, and he's writing a psalm of lament, it's not just for him; it's for the community. Psalm 22, and you get to the end, he's talking about, I'm making this declaration in the midst of the congregation. These texts that we lean into, these texts of lament, Job and some of these others, these were never intended to sort of be read in quiet, private Bible study the way that we do things now. This was always the documents of the community. So I think part of the problem that we have with lament is, number one, we don't do it. And then number two, when we do it, we do it alone. And we forget that the whole point of this is that we lean into one another's pain and suffering, and we bear one another up as we share that pain and suffering. And I think there's something really powerful in that. I think you're exactly right. In the West, I think, and certainly in the United States, we're taught to bury our emotions. We're taught to compartmentalize things. You don't bring your personal pain to the workplace. You don't bring it here. You don't bring it there. Maybe you bring it home, but you don't want it to affect your relationship too much. So what do? Well, you end up burying it, and you cover it with work, and you cover it with all of these other things, and then we never really deal with it. And it just tears us up. I mean, there's something really, I think, cathartic and powerful about yelling at God. God's a big boy. He can handle it. He created the universe with his words. You being angry, or me being angry at God for a period of time as we're sort of processing through what we're experiencing, I think is part of the process that God is leading us through. I mean, all of the great people of faith, I think, that we see in Scripture have their moments where either they're not sure what's going on, and so they do questionable things, or they're confronting their understanding of God. I mean, gosh, David has such a frank, I think, relationship with God in terms of how he talks to him, where a lot of times David's like, you need to be the God that you said you were going to be.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's like, David, easy. You got a resume right now that's not always the greatest.
Yeah.
And I think in this moment, it's us as a community of sufferers at points being drawn into this deeper sense of suffering, but it's us being drawn into suffering together. And I think, you did a wonderful series a while back on Lamentations and Lament, and I think we need to spend more time sort of embracing that language and lamenting together.
And yeah, I just think it's so tragic. I think I hope, at least for me, that I always remember this time as we've been apart, because it's so powerful to get together and lament. And I wish that we had the opportunity. The live stream and connecting that way is a blessing, and I'm thankful for the technology that we have. But I just think that just the showing up and being next to each other, like the standing, when you go to a funeral, it's not necessarily that anybody says anything profound, and oftentimes it's somebody just jumbled up in front weeping. But there's something really powerful about just coming together and saying together, basically, this sucks. This is really hard, and I don't know that I can go another day doing this.
Sometimes life is a dumpster fire, and you just want some people to stand around and be with you while it burns.
Yeah.
And the fire's going to go out eventually, and you'll move past it. But, everybody being able to stand around and go, yeah,
one day,
it's as terrible as you think it is. Yeah.
One day, probably just a really hard day that Manny and I had we had a couple deaths unexpected at our church. It was just a really hard day. There was a lot that happened, and we came home, and the dumpster behind our house was literally on fire. We're like,
Yeah.
all right, thanks God, thanks for that, like little bit of humor. But
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes you're just in that space, and I think oftentimes when we're in that space, again, we kind of just bury it. But Jesus shows us no, the way through it is to be honest and to say this is wrong. One final thing I wanted to mention is the centurion saying, "Surely this is the Son of God." And what I find interesting, and there's another one which we'll talk about next week, but I find interesting in the crucifixion stories, the things that happen that you're like, there's no way that they like made that up. Like there's like that one, like that a centurion, that a Roman centurion, like this is Mark, who is like writing the story of Jesus, and in my opinion, then saying just being as honest as possible, because nobody's going to put a Roman centurion as the one who says like, surely this man was the Son of God, after the Jews didn't get it, the Jewish disciples didn't get it, and just like this outside person who is a total representation of like empire and like everything that's wrong with what's happened to the Jews, and like he gets it, and it's just that to me is a real interesting curveball.
Well, and I think it just provides this really wonderful bookending to the beginning of the gospel. Mark 1:1, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So Mark begins by saying Jesus is Son of God, Caesar is not. We're going to show you what good news looks like. It's not the birth of Augustus. It's Jesus' story is good news. And it's here at the end that a Roman centurion who has probably stood there for 6 hours and watched Jesus suffer and watched something that maybe he has never seen before. Because you have to imagine, he's probably seen hundreds of people crucified in his life. And there's something about this moment. There's something about what happens with Jesus. There's something about these last moments of Jesus' life when the air escapes his lungs for the last time. And this man says, this is the Son of God. And I think it's a really, really powerful moment where recognition of the truth sometimes comes from the most unlikely of places and unlikely of sources. And here we have this Roman centurion who says, this is the Son of God.
I hadn't thought about the idea that it's likely that he watched this for 6 hours. Like the idea that it's the suffering that shows like, oh, this is the Son of God, not the glory, not the miracles, not. There's a lot of really important things that Jesus does throughout the Gospel of Mark and told in other Gospels as well. But like seeing the suffering and standing with it for all that time, and him not using his power for some selfish end, but just the way he just literally pours every part of himself out.
Yeah.
And it's in that the centurion says, surely that was the Son of God.
Well, and it's even sort of interesting too that there's this interesting juxtaposition where at the end of their lives, many of the Caesars, if they were deemed good enough, they would be declared deified. They would be declared as gods or certainly Son of God, but gods. And it's this idea of, you do all these great things and you are ultimately lifted up in glory. And here we have Jesus who's lifted up on a cross and whose engagement is not sort of as powerful king and Caesar and destroyer of people and nations. It's his body that's being destroyed. It's this just the opposite of what you would expect from a Greco-Roman perspective. And this man who has seen Jesus suffer for 6 hours, who's seen hundreds of people crucified, who's probably been engaged in bloody combat at various points in his career, who has seen and experienced the power of the Roman Empire, who knows very well this idea of deifying the Caesars and their relationship to the divine, says, this man is Son of God. I mean, it's a really, really powerful witness when you start to think about, of all the people that could have declared Jesus' divine sonship, it's this Roman centurion. So yeah, it's a really powerful moment.
And I think when we think about our relationship with God and what we want God to do in our world. It's so often, if we're honest, just about our kingdom and what's happening, like, God, let me pray for this thing. And sometimes it's like important stuff, but, help me to figure this out or make the situation better. Like, what if we could adjust that to say, like, God, help me to be poured out in this situation. Help me to be sacrificial in the way that I choose to love in this situation. I'm not going to just say, you fix it all for me, but I think oftentimes it's in that, okay, I'm going to choose to be sacrificially loving that does fix it in a better way than we could have imagined. If we just say, all right, I'm going to give up some of my selfishness and what I'm trying to like force into the situation, and just to say, God, I'm going to turn this over to you and trust you, and just going to try to pour myself out as Jesus was.
Yeah. So sometimes in one of my classes, we'll do a discussion at the end of the semester on Jesus through different religious traditions, and this actually really fits well. There's a series of Buddhist parables that I like to read sometimes to some of my students, and there's this one about a student who's gone to a teacher and wants to be taught Zen Buddhism by this teacher, and as they're getting acquainted, the teacher takes out a couple of cups and starts to pour tea, and he's pouring tea into the student's cup, and it's just overflowing and overflowing and overflowing, and the student doesn't want to say anything because he doesn't want to embarrass the teacher, and so finally he's just like, I can't, like, I've had enough, and he says, stop pouring the tea, you're overflowing it, and the teacher essentially says, well, in the same way, if you want to be poured into, you have to empty your cup. Like, you've come here for something, but your cup is full. And I think we spend so much of our time either with full cups or trying to fill our cups. And here we see Jesus who's just being emptied. I mean, just fully emptied. There's nothing left. He's given it all. And I think you're right in that so often for us, we're thinking about and we're praying about how can God be pouring into us, when I think the prayer really should be, God, how can you pour me out in this situation? How can I be poured out in a way that is a blessing to others? And I think I'm not particularly good at that prayer, to be honest. I'm still more of the God pour into me, like give me more so I can give more kind of thing. Yeah. Not empty me in this way so that I can be this vessel for you. And I think, again, it's just what this man would have seen and experienced in that 6 hours to make him come to this revelation is something that's not even fully contained in the pages here. Yeah, it's not contained in these lines. And I think that in its own way is some of the power and mystery of Christ. Yeah, and this story has changed the world and continues to change the world. Amen. And so we are out of time, and I think it's a great way to end. I hope that as you consider this story, maybe for the first time, but if not, maybe for the 1,000th time, that you would think about in your relationships in your life, what does it look like for you to be poured out so that you can do the work of God in the world? Because this is a very, very raw story. You can join us for our prayer call at 8 p.m. If you want information on that, you can email me again, Brian with a Y at Glendale.church. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Justin, as always, for your time and your thoughts. Hope you guys have a great evening.